would be the wife, the husband, or one of the children. Mm-hmm. When tragedy strikes, families tend to fall apart.
Yes, they do.
Okay, tonight we will learn some new and positive ways to keep the family together and actually help them thrive. Mm-hmm. We have very special guests on the line that we will bring in later. Mm-hmm. Rob and Heidi Whitaker.
Yes.
They're visiting us remote from the beautiful Salt Lake City, Utah area. Mm-hmm. Heidi was diagnosed with a chronic illness 2 weeks into her marriage, and that lasted 15 years.
For 15 years, yes.
Okay. In that time, she gave birth to 4 children, all of which had severe health challenges themselves.
Yes, they did.
Okay. We'll be doing a 90-minute broadcast this evening due to the amount of material that we'll be presenting and discussing.
Absolutely. And for anyone that'd like to participate and call in on the show this evening, the number is 480-409-0773. Again, the number is 480-409-0773. And when you call in and we answer, you're just going to be placed on hold for a little bit, and then when we're to that part, then we'll bring you on the line. But tonight's show is about how families are affected when someone becomes ill. Whether it's a child, a spouse, or even a parent, everything in the family dynamic shifts and often falls apart. We're scared, we're lonely, we feel guilty. We have all these different feelings going on at the same time. We feel ripped off, disappointed, often grieving long before the time is even there to. Being that Leaf and I are relationship recovery coaches, and I have a daughter who is critically ill for 5 years, we're going to be sharing some very good coaching techniques to help bring your family back into balance. And also with our guests this evening, Heidi and Rob, she is going to share a plethora of ideas and ways that her and her family battled the issues that they had. So I'm looking forward to that as well.
Right. Well, first we'll begin by talking a little about these various illnesses and the ones that Heidi faced as well, and the complications that they caused, yes, along with some signs and symptoms.
Yes.
Okay. Afterwards, we'll share some very helpful information for families currently facing an illness in their family. Then at about 7:20, we'll welcome Rob and Heidi on the show. At 7:50, we'll open up our phone lines, and we highly encourage our listeners to call in if you need support or
yes,
you have any thoughts or any other situations that you'd like to discuss with us. We'd love to have you join us.
Love to have you join us, Jess. So if you have someone going through an illness right now, or you're going through an illness, it'd be a great time to bring them on the show. Oftentimes, we're really not given those tools in the doctor's office when we come home, and everything kind of has a tendency to fall apart. My own daughter, Taryn, was diagnosed with severe chronic neutropenia when she was 5 years old.
Wow.
And it lasted for 5 years. What neutropenia is, it has to do with the white blood cell, the neutrophil. And her body didn't produce enough. So a normal white blood cell count is normally between 7 and 14, and hers was 1 or less. When she would get a cold, it would quickly turn into sinus infection, bronchitis,
wow,
pneumonia. We'd end up in the hospital on IV antibiotics. Mm-hmm. The biggest risk of this disease was overwhelming infection in the blood, which would lead to infection of the brain and heart, which
wow,
ultimately leads to death.
That's pretty scary.
Yeah, we lived like that for 5 years, with that fear. And what it did to our family, and it's not that it's ever anyone's fault, but, that the family falls apart. You go into blaming each other, and you go
sure,
into, you're feeling guilty because this is something you can't fix. The husband in the relationship feels guilty sometimes because it's something that he can't fix. And you go through all these world of emotions, and the family often ends in divorce, which you're going to talk about later on in the show, is the divorce statistics for people having these problems. So as Taryn today is better, she healed when she was 10 years old, and all that fear that I had really didn't serve anybody at the time.
No, it didn't. No, it didn't. One of the biggest factors affecting family today is a lack of support from friends and family.
Yes.
Especially when your child is sick. People get afraid when you have a sick child.
They do.
They're secretly afraid or that it could be their child.
Yes.
Some don't want to get too close because if the child dies, that means that they may have to go to a child's funeral, and that would really be a tough thing to deal with.
For some, it's just too much, and I know when my daughter was sick, I remember, we were in and out of school, and the parents sometimes, sometimes people just don't know what to say. And, I can understand that. A lot of it is self-preservation.
Sure
but
is.
Also, I had lost a lot of friends.
Mm-hmm.
People just stopped coming around. People stopped calling. I had my core friends, and of course, I had
Right.
my mother and my sister and my ex-husband's family. It was obviously very active, but people just have a tendency to pull away out of fear.
Mm-hmm.
And I think sometimes too, just ignorance. They don't really understand what's going on.
Yes. And when you're taking care of a sick parent, it can be hard to get your own sisters and brothers to help out.
Absolutely.
Ever notice how in a lot of situations it's one person in the family who does everything?
Yes.
When you have a spouse that's sick, some people are hesitant to get involved with that as well.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe they're afraid it may happen to them. I think it hits very close to home.
Mm-hmm.
And they're uncomfortable. They, don't know what to say. I think that the shocking thing to me, it's the most shocking, is the divorce statistics around all of this. And we'll touch on that later as well, like Kristen said.
Absolutely. We talked about divorce rates in our first episode in first, second, and third marriage, and now you're going to add chronic and severe illness to it, and it's a whole different story. In Heidi's case, our guest that's joining us today, after her marriage, she developed Epstein-Barr virus, which eventually led to chronic fatigue syndrome, which led to depression, and ultimately to anxiety and panic attacks.
Right.
I want to talk a little bit about Epstein-Barr, because some people listening may not understand these too well, and of course she's going to fill us on a little more later. Epstein-Barr is a very common virus.
Right.
Most people get it at least once in their life. It's actually part of the same virus that causes cold sores, chickenpox, and shingles. And while it's not technically an autoimmune disorder, it most definitely attacks the immune system, leading way for other things to get in, because your immune system is compromised, right?
Sure.
So then she developed chronic fatigue syndrome. Now, I always thought chronic fatigue and Epstein-Barr were the same thing.
I was going to say the same thing. I, until just recently, did not realize they're two separate.
Yeah, two separate things. So chronic fatigue is characterized by having debilitating and complex fatigue, which cannot be made better by sleeping.
Right.
There's no test, there's no blood work, there's no MRI. It's figured out by...
kind of just logical deduction.
Yeah, exactly.
What is it not?
And it can take up to 6 months for a diagnosis. So in the meantime, you have this illness, you don't know what's going on with you, and you're not getting any better.
Mm-hmm.
After that, she started to develop depression, and we all know how depression can take an effect, and I'll let you talk about depression for a little bit.
The rates of depression in women are twice that of men.
Yes.
And this is due partially to hormonal factors, particularly when it comes to premenstrual syndrome,
premenstrual dysphoric disorder.
Right. Postpartum depression and perimenopausal depression.
Yes.
As for signs and symptoms, women are more likely than men to experience pronounced feelings of guilt, sleep excessively, overeat, or gain weight. And women are more likely to suffer from seasonal
affective disorder.
I'm sorry.
That's okay. Seasonal affective disorder is, kind of like what we had up north, cabin fever.
Oh, okay, cabin fever.
Yeah, our parents would kind of, send us outside, to blow the stink off, as they used to say, because we kind of get cooped up a little bit.
Now, with the postpartum depression...
Yeah, you had some experience with that with your first wife.
With my first wife, yes. Unlike the baby blues, postpartum depression is a more serious problem.
Yes.
It's one that shouldn't be ignored. However, it's not always easy to distinguish between the two. Mm-hmm. Okay, in the beginning, postpartum depression can look a lot like the normal baby blues. In fact, postpartum depression and the baby blues share many symptoms, including mood swings, crying, sadness, insomnia, and irritability. The difference is, with postpartum depression, the symptoms are more severe, such as suicidal thoughts or the inability to care for a newborn. and they last a lot longer. So if you're feeling any of these, please seek medical help.
And that's the thing too with postpartum depression. So many women feel embarrassed, they're afraid.
Sure.
And that's with depression in general. We're made to believe, buck up, put on your big girl panties and deal with it. And, you can only do that for so long.
Sometimes you need to get help from a doctor.
Absolutely.
And there's nothing wrong with it.
Absolutely. Depression can be a true medical disorder. And on top of all this, we don't know if there's a medical underlying effect. When I was a teenager, I was in the hospital off and on for, acting out behavior, and they were trying to diagnose me with bipolar disorder and all these things. And I actually had an underactive thyroid.
And that's all it was.
It had nothing to do with that. So,
right.
It's always good to go to a doctor and get medical help.
Right. And Heidi also developed anxiety.
Yes.
And generalized anxiety disorder is a mood disorder that's characterized by multiple and or nonspecific worries that interfere with the person's life in some way. Mm-hmm. Okay, for some people, anxiety prevents them from even leaving their house. Mm-hmm. We have a friend like that.
Yeah, he's going through that, yes. He's afraid to leave his house.
And that's terrible. It can be a mentally crippling disorder. Mm-hmm. In the case of Heidi, though, she did not drive a car for 15 years. That would be hard. For 15
years, she could not drive a car from anxiety, and people really underestimate.
And anxiety can cause panic attacks, which are sudden surges of overwhelming anxiety and fear. Mm-hmm. Okay, in many cases, it strikes out of the blue. Often strikes when you're away from home, but it can happen anywhere, at any time. And you may have one while you're even just shopping in a store, or walking down the street, or driving a car, or even sitting on the couch at home.
I had an anxiety attack for the first time after I had the girls. I was shopping in the store. I had been on bed rest for a while, so it had been a while since I'd been out of the house. And I was in the store. I was in Montgomery Ward, minding my own business. And all of a sudden, I got ready to go on the escalator.
Right.
And I went into pure panic. I was like, oh my gosh, and I'm starting to sweat, and my heart is pounding, and I'm terrified. And it lasted about 20 minutes. So I had to call my husband at the time and say, no, I can't drive. I can't leave here right now.
Wow.
And it took me a little while to come down from it. Mm-hmm.
And often people can wind up going to the hospital because they believe they're having a heart attack.
Yeah, that's true.
That's how serious some of these attacks can be. Mm-hmm. They can cause chest pains, sweating, delusion, fear, and even a need to just get out of where you're at.
All these disorders and diseases can really play a toll on the relationship, and I'm really excited to hear Rob and Heidi's story about how they did it in their relationship.
So am I.
And I'd like to switch gears here just for a moment and talk about, what do we do when the bottom is falling out, when there seems to be no end in sight? When we have the stomach flu, it may seem like a daunting task. It lasts for a weekend. But what happens when it goes on for days? And days turn into weeks.
Right.
And weeks turn into months. And months turn into years.
That would be hard.
It is very hard. What do you do when it just isn't over? Mm-hmm. Millions of families face this situation today, and it's not anything that any of us had ever anticipated.
Right.
And the divorce rate amongst these families is sky high. What happens? What happens is that the family turns on each other and they don't work together. And I personally believe, the number one reason is fear.
I think so.
And fear defined is false evidence appearing real. And as a parent and as a spouse, we're terrified that our loved one is going to die. It causes all kinds of responses, which are negative. My ex-husband and I used to argue a lot. Mm-hmm. I think what happens is because we're so afraid, it becomes a defense mechanism, to push your spouse away. When we act out at each other, we feel that no one around understands us. No one feels like we're going through. We feel like we're helpless. We feel useless. And we feel like a failure.
Sure.
Our child is sick. We can't fix them. Our spouse is sick. We can't fix them. As men who are the primary caregivers, they're the fixers. They can't do anything. And everything just gets out of control.
Sure.
I think the second thing that goes wrong or that occurs with us is anger. We're angry this happened to our child or family member. We begin acting out at others, who are seemingly happy. Heidi and I had a conversation on the phone this week, and she even said, she remembers being in the store one day and seeing a cashier, and she's smiling, checking out the groceries, and her thinking, how dare you be happy when I'm going through this terrible time. And I used to go through the same thing. Right. I'm, jetting through the mall doing whatever, and I see all these smiling people, and I'm thinking, how dare hear you. Be happy. Don't you
Right.
know what I'm going through? And I became what I called, the parent of the half-dead child.
Okay.
Because, I couldn't do this because my child might die. Well, I can't do that because my child may die. I was so in grief because of what could happen. I never allowed myself to experience what was happening, which, she survived.
Can't process it.
Exactly. And the third thing I think that we get worried about is finances.
Oh, yeah.